DNA finally revealed the truth. The Christine Jessop murder case, Part 1. Silence. On the afternoon of October 3, 1984, a 9-year-old girl left her home for what should have been a short walk. She never came back. For days, volunteers searched fields, forests, and country roads across rural Ontario. Police followed every lead they could find. Parents kept their children indoors. A quiet community found itself asking one terrifying question: how could a child simply disappear? Weeks later, that question became even more heartbreaking. Christine Jessop was found dead. But the mystery surrounding her murder would only deepen. An innocent man would spend years under suspicion. A wrongful conviction would shake Canada's justice system. And for more than 3 decades, Christine's family would continue waiting for the one thing they never stopped hoping for: the truth. It would take advances in forensic DNA technology, decades of careful evidence preservation, and persistent investigators before one of Canada's most famous cold cases was finally solved. This is not just the story of a murder investigation. It is also the story of how science corrected one of the country's greatest miscarriages of justice, and how a little girl's case changed Canadian criminal investigations forever. This is the Christine Jessop case. Who was Christine Jessop? Before she became known across Canada, Christine was simply a little girl. Christine Jessop was born in 1975 and lived with her family near the rural community of Queensville, Ontario, north of Toronto. Friends and relatives remembered her as cheerful, energetic, and curious. Like many children her age, she enjoyed spending time outdoors, playing with friends, and exploring the countryside around her home. The Jessop family lived in what many considered a peaceful community. Neighbors knew one another. Children often walked short distances without concern. It was the kind of place where families believed their children were safe. Nothing suggested that October 1984 would change their lives forever. Christine's parents worked hard to provide a loving home. Family photographs captured birthdays, holidays, and ordinary childhood moments. Looking back today, those photographs carry a painful weight. They preserve memories of a little girl whose future would be stolen far too soon. In 1984, Canada had already experienced high-profile child abduction cases, but communities like Queensville still felt insulated from such tragedies. People believed terrible crimes happened somewhere else. Not here, not in their neighborhood, not to someone they knew. That belief would soon be shattered. October 3, 1984, Wednesday, October 3rd, began like many other autumn days. The weather was cool. Trees had started changing color across southern Ontario. Children attended school. Adults went to work. Nothing appeared unusual. At some point during the afternoon, Christine left home intending to walk a relatively short distance. According to investigators, she never reached her destination. When she failed to return home, concern quickly turned into alarm. Her family began searching immediately. Neighbors joined them. Soon, police were notified. Officers treated the disappearance seriously from the very beginning. Missing child investigations are always time-sensitive. The first hours are often the most critical. Police interviewed family members. Neighbors were questioned. Search teams examined nearby roads, wooded areas, and fields. Volunteers arrived to help. As daylight faded into darkness, search efforts intensified rather than slowed. People refused to give up. Many believed Christine was simply lost. Others hoped someone had taken her in temporarily. Few wanted to imagine the worst. By the following morning, additional officers had joined the search. Helicopters surveyed the countryside. Tracking dogs were deployed. Investigators carefully documented every lead, every reported sighting, every telephone call, every possible clue. News of Christine's disappearance spread rapidly through local media. Parents across Ontario watched the reports with growing concern. Schools discussed safety with students. Communities organized additional volunteer searches. For the Jessop family, every passing hour felt endless. Hope remained, but uncertainty grew heavier. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood. Police considered every possibility. Had Christine become lost? Had she accepted a ride from someone she knew? Or had she been abducted by a stranger? At that stage, investigators simply did not know. Without reliable eyewitnesses identifying exactly what had happened after Christine left home, detectives had to reconstruct her final known movements piece by piece. They carefully examined the route she was believed to have taken. Potential witnesses were interviewed repeatedly. Motorists who had traveled nearby roads were asked whether they had seen anything unusual. Every tip was recorded, even information that initially appeared insignificant, because in major investigations, the smallest detail can later become the most important. Days passed, then weeks. The search continued, but Christine remained missing. The entire province seemed to be watching. Families who had never met the Jessops prayed for good news. Police refused to stop searching. They knew one fact remained certain. Somewhere, someone knew what had happened. Eventually, the investigation took a devastating turn. A discovery ended hopes that Christine would be found alive. It also transformed a missing person investigation into one of Canada's largest homicide cases. But even then, the hardest questions still had no answers. Who killed Christine Jessop? Why? And could investigators prove it? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Cases like Christine's remind us why every missing child investigation matters, no matter where in the world it happens. The search for Christine Jessop continued day after day. Volunteers returned each morning, hoping that this would be the day she would be found alive. Police officers expanded the search beyond the roads surrounding Queensville. Farm fields were carefully examined. Wooded areas were searched repeatedly. Helicopters flew overhead while tracking dogs followed every scent they could. The entire community united around one goal: bring Christine home. As the days passed, investigators received hundreds of tips. Some people believed they had seen a young girl walking along a nearby road. Others reported unfamiliar vehicles. Every report was documented. Every witness was interviewed. Detectives understood that memories fade quickly, so they worked tirelessly to preserve every detail while it was still fresh. Christine's family remained at the center of the investigation. Police maintained regular contact with them, updating them whenever new developments emerged. Like every family facing the disappearance of a child, they lived through endless uncertainty. Each telephone call brought hope. Each day without answers brought fear. Then, on October 31st, 1984, nearly 4 weeks after Christine disappeared, investigators made the discovery they had feared. Christine's body was found in a heavily wooded area near Sunderland, Ontario, several kilometers from where she had vanished. The discovery transformed the investigation overnight. This was no longer a missing person case. It was now a homicide investigation. The Ontario Provincial Police assumed a leading investigative role alongside local authorities. The area where Christine was found was immediately secured as a major crime scene. Forensic specialists photographed everything. Physical evidence was carefully collected and preserved. Investigators knew they might only have one opportunity to recover evidence capable of identifying the person responsible. Although the medical examination confirmed that Christine had been murdered, investigators were careful about what information they released publicly. Certain forensic details were intentionally withheld. Keeping specific information confidential is a common investigative practice. It allows detectives to distinguish genuine confessions or credible witnesses from false claims made by individuals seeking attention. As news spread across Canada, public shock quickly turned into grief. Parents held their children a little closer. Schools discussed safety. Communities organized memorials for Christine and offered support to her family. For investigators, however, the work had only just begun. Finding Christine answered one heartbreaking question. But the most important question remained: who killed her? Detectives began reconstructing Christine's final known movements, with even greater urgency. Every witness interview was reviewed again. Timelines were refined. Known vehicles in the area were documented. People who had encountered Christine during the afternoon of October 3 were interviewed repeatedly. The investigation gradually focused on individuals who had lived or worked near Christine's community. One of those individuals was Guy Paul Morin. Morin lived in the area and became a person of investigative interest during the early stages of the homicide investigation. Like many major investigations, detectives compared witness statements, timelines, and available forensic evidence as they attempted to determine whether any individual could be connected to the crime. As the investigation progressed, police increasingly concentrated their efforts on Morin. He consistently denied any involvement in Christine's murder. Nevertheless, investigators believed they had sufficient grounds to continue examining his activities and collecting evidence. The case soon became one of Canada's highest-profile criminal investigations. Media attention intensified. Newspaper headlines followed nearly every development. Television crews reported daily updates. Public pressure on investigators continued to grow. Everyone wanted the same answer. Who killed Christine Jessop? As months passed, detectives believed they had identified the person responsible. Charges were eventually brought against Guy Paul Morin. The announcement appeared to bring the investigation closer to justice. But history would later reveal that the case was far more complicated than anyone imagined. The evidence presented against Morin would become the subject of intense legal scrutiny. Questions would emerge regarding witness testimony, scientific analysis, and the reliability of the investigation itself. Years later, those questions would fundamentally change Canada's criminal justice system. Investigators believed they had found the person responsible for Christine's murder. Based only on the evidence we've covered so far, would you have expected the case to end here, or did you think there was more to uncover? Share your thoughts respectfully before we continue. The next chapter of Christine Jessop's story would not simply become a murder trial. It would become one of the most significant wrongful conviction cases in Canadian history. The announcement that Guy Paul Morin had been charged with Christine Jessop's murder was met with relief by many members of the public. After months of uncertainty, it appeared investigators had found the man responsible. For Christine's family, there was hope that justice might finally be within reach. But in criminal investigations, an arrest is only the beginning. The responsibility now shifted from police investigators to the courtroom. The prosecution would have to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Guy Paul Morin had murdered 9-year-old Christine Jessop. The first trial began in 1986. Prosecutors presented evidence they believed connected Morin to the crime. Witnesses testified. Investigators described the investigation. Forensic experts explained the scientific evidence available at the time. Morin maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. His defense argued that the evidence was insufficient and challenged key aspects of the Crown's case. After hearing weeks of testimony, the jury reached its decision. Guy Paul Morin was acquitted. Legally, he walked free. But the investigation did not end. The acquittal did not identify another suspect. Christine's murder remained unsolved. Public pressure continued to mount. Investigators continued reviewing the evidence, believing the case still had unanswered questions. Several years later, following additional developments in the investigation, Morin was tried again. At the time, Canadian law permitted a new trial after the earlier acquittal had been overturned on appeal due to legal issues. The second trial began in 1992. Once again, prosecutors argued that Morin was responsible for Christine's murder. This time, additional forensic testimony was introduced. Experts also discussed microscopic hair comparison, a forensic discipline widely relied upon during that era. Today, many forensic scientists recognize the limitations of microscopic hair comparison when used without DNA confirmation. But in the early 1990s, it remained commonly presented in court. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a different verdict. Guy Paul Morin was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. For many observers, the case appeared finished. The man responsible had been convicted. Justice, they believed, had finally been achieved, but history would prove otherwise. While Morin served his sentence, advances in forensic science were beginning to transform criminal investigations around the world. DNA profiling, still relatively new during the early years of Christine's investigation, was becoming increasingly reliable. Cases once dependent upon witness testimony or microscopic comparisons could now be examined using far more precise scientific methods. Morin's legal team requested DNA testing on biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. Fortunately, investigators had carefully retained critical evidence from 1984. That decision would ultimately change everything. Laboratory scientists conducted modern DNA analysis on the preserved evidence. Unlike earlier forensic techniques, DNA testing could directly compare biological material to specific individuals with extraordinary accuracy. When the results were completed, they did not support the conviction. Instead, the testing excluded Guy Paul Morin as the source of the biological evidence. The implications were enormous. If the DNA did not belong to Morin, then investigators and the courts had convicted the wrong man. In 1995, after spending years in prison for a crime he did not commit, Guy Paul Morin's conviction was overturned, and he was officially acquitted based on the new DNA evidence. The decision shocked Canada. One of the country's highest-profile murder convictions had collapsed because of advances in forensic science. For Christine's family, the ruling brought mixed emotions. An innocent man had been imprisoned, but Christine's real killer had never been identified. The case was once again unsolved. Recognizing the seriousness of what had occurred, the government of Ontario established the Commission on Proceedings involving Guy Paul Morin, led by Justice Fred Part 4, 36 years of silence. When Guy Paul Morin was officially cleared in 1995, the justice system had corrected a terrible mistake. But for Christine Jessop's family, the most important question remained unanswered. Who had killed Christine? Investigators now faced an unusual challenge. They were essentially beginning again. The original investigation had started in 1984. More than a decade had passed. Witnesses' memories had faded. Some people had moved away. Others had died. Physical locations had changed. Yet one critical advantage remained. The biological evidence collected from Christine's homicide had been carefully preserved. That decision would eventually prove invaluable. Rather than abandoning the investigation, the Ontario Provincial Police and York Regional Police continued treating Christine's murder as an active cold case. Cold cases are different from ordinary investigations. Detectives often revisit every piece of evidence repeatedly as new forensic techniques become available. Evidence that cannot answer questions today may provide those answers years later. That philosophy guided investigators throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s. Every few years, advancements in forensic DNA technology created new possibilities. Techniques became more sensitive. Smaller biological samples could be analyzed. Profiles that had once been incomplete could now be examined with far greater precision. Each advancement encouraged investigators to review Christine's case once again. Throughout those years, Christine's family continued waiting. Anniversaries came and went. Birthdays passed. Media organizations periodically revisited the case, reminding Canadians that Christine's murder remained unsolved. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin also became one of Canada's most important criminal justice lessons. Police academies, law schools, prosecutors, defense attorneys, forensic scientists, all studied the case, not because the investigation had ended successfully, but because it demonstrated how wrongful convictions can occur when evidence is misunderstood or interpreted incorrectly. Justice Fred Kaufman's public inquiry resulted in recommendations that significantly influenced Canadian policing and prosecution practices. Those recommendations emphasized objective forensic science, full disclosure of evidence, proper investigative procedures, and safeguards designed to reduce the risk of future wrongful convictions. Although those reforms emerged from tragedy, they helped strengthen Canada's justice system for future investigations. Meanwhile, Christine's murder investigation quietly continued behind the scenes. Detectives never stopped searching for the person whose DNA had been recovered decades earlier. But there was a problem. Investigators possessed the killer's DNA profile. They simply did not know whose DNA it was. National DNA databases were searched repeatedly. No match appeared. Years passed. Then more years. Still nothing. Many cold cases remain unsolved because investigators have DNA from an unknown individual who has never been arrested for another offense. Without a matching profile or another investigative lead, detectives can find themselves waiting for science to advance once again. By the late 2010s, that advancement had arrived. A new investigative method known as investigative genetic genealogy began attracting worldwide attention. Unlike traditional DNA database comparisons used in criminal investigations, investigative genetic genealogy examines DNA relationships through publicly available genealogy databases when legally authorized and appropriate. The technique had already helped solve several high-profile cold cases. Most notably, it contributed to identifying the suspect in the Golden State Killer investigation in the United States. Canadian investigators carefully studied whether similar methods could assist in Christine Jessop's case. The preserved biological evidence was once again submitted for advanced analysis. This time, investigators hoped the DNA could identify not merely an unknown profile, but relatives connected to the unknown individual. Professional genealogists worked alongside investigators. Family trees were constructed. Historical records were reviewed. Birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, public documents. Every branch of every family tree was examined carefully. The work required extraordinary patience. Unlike television dramas, investigative genetic genealogy is not instantaneous. It can require months or even years of meticulous research. Every possible relationship must be verified. Every conclusion must be supported by evidence. Eventually, one family line began attracting investigators' attention. The genealogy research pointed toward a man named Calvin Hoover. Hoover had lived in Ontario during the period when Christine disappeared. More importantly, he had died in 2015. Because Hoover was deceased, investigators could not obtain a direct DNA sample from him. Instead, they turned to preserved biological evidence collected during his autopsy. Scientists compared Hoover's DNA profile with the biological evidence preserved from Christine Jessop's homicide. The results were decisive. According to York Regional Police, the DNA recovered from Christine's clothing matched Calvin Hoover. After 36 years, investigators had finally identified the man responsible. There would be no criminal trial. Hoover had died 5 years earlier, but investigators publicly announced that the DNA evidence identified him as Christine Jessop's killer and that Guy Paul Morin had been completely excluded decades earlier, confirming his innocence beyond question. The announcement represented one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in Canadian history. Science had finally accomplished what investigators in 1984 could not. It had identified the true killer. 36 years after Christine disappeared, DNA technology finally answered the question investigators had pursued for decades. Before we conclude this story, what do you think has been the greatest advancement in modern criminal investigations? DNA analysis, investigative genealogy, or improvements in evidence preservation? Share your thoughts respectfully below. The mystery that had haunted Canada for more than 3 decades was finally solved. But for Christine's family, knowing the killer's name could never erase the loss they had carried since 1984. Part 5. Justice. Too late. On October 15, 2020, investigators stood before cameras with information that Canada had waited more than 3 decades to hear. The DNA evidence had finally identified Calvin Hoover as the man responsible for Christine Jessop's murder. The announcement came from York Regional Police, who had spent years working alongside forensic scientists, genealogists, and other law enforcement agencies to solve one of Canada's longest-running cold cases. Chief among their priorities was clarity. Investigators explained that the identification was based on advanced DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy, supported by additional investigative work. Just as importantly, they emphasized another point. Guy Paul Morin was completely innocent. The DNA evidence that identified Hoover also confirmed what earlier testing had already shown. Morin had never been the source of the biological evidence recovered during the investigation. For Morin, the announcement represented more than legal vindication. Although his conviction had been overturned decades earlier, the identification of the true killer finally removed any lingering uncertainty that some members of the public may have still held. His name was permanently separated from Christine's murder. For Christine's family, however, the announcement brought emotions that are difficult to describe. There were answers, but there would never be a trial. There would never be a guilty plea. There would never be an opportunity to confront the man investigators concluded had taken Christine's life. Because Calvin Hoover had died in 2015, 5 years before investigators identified him through DNA. The criminal justice system had finally solved the case, but it could no longer prosecute the person responsible. York Regional Police explained that investigators had continued examining the case for years, never abandoning the evidence collected in 1984. The preservation of biological evidence became one of the defining reasons the investigation ultimately succeeded. Without those carefully stored exhibits, without decades of forensic advances, without investigators willing to reopen old files, Christine's murder may have remained unsolved forever. The announcement also renewed national discussion about investigative genetic genealogy. The technique had already gained international attention after helping solve several major cold cases. Christine Jessop's case demonstrated that it could also provide answers in investigations that had remained unsolved for generations. Still, investigators emphasized an important point. Genetic genealogy alone did not solve the case. It served as an investigative lead. Every conclusion still required confirmation through traditional investigative methods and direct DNA comparison. Science pointed investigators toward Hoover. The evidence confirmed it. That distinction remains essential in modern criminal investigations. Following the announcement, many Canadians reflected on everything Christine's case had changed. It exposed weaknesses in forensic interpretation during the 1980s and early 1990s. It reshaped police investigative practices. It influenced prosecutorial disclosure standards. It contributed to reforms designed to reduce wrongful convictions. And ultimately, it demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving evidence, even when technology has not yet caught up to the questions investigators are trying to answer. Today, the Kaufman Commission, established after Guy Paul Morin's exoneration, is widely recognized as one of the most influential public inquiries in Canadian criminal justice history. Its recommendations continue to influence investigators, prosecutors, forensic laboratories, and police training throughout Canada. Christine Jessop's case became more than a homicide investigation. It became a lesson, a reminder that justice requires patience, that science continues to evolve, and that investigators must always remain willing to question earlier conclusions when new evidence emerges. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the investigation is its timeline. From Christine's disappearance in 1984 to the wrongful conviction and later exoneration of Guy Paul Morin, to the identification of Calvin Hoover in 2020, the pursuit of truth lasted 36 years. Very few criminal investigations span nearly 4 decades. Even fewer end with answers made possible by scientific methods that did not exist when the crime occurred. For Christine's family, however, time cannot measure loss. Every birthday missed, every family gathering with an empty chair, every anniversary. Those moments cannot be restored. Justice may answer legal questions. It cannot restore stolen years. As investigators concluded their final news conference, one message stood above every other. The investigation was complete. Christine Jessop's killer had been identified through verified DNA evidence. The wrongful conviction had been fully corrected, and one of Canada's oldest cold cases had finally reached its conclusion. Christine's case reminds us that preserving evidence can make the difference between a mystery that lasts forever and one that is solved decades later. What part of this investigation left the biggest impression on you? The persistence of investigators, the advances in DNA science, or the correction of a wrongful conviction? Please keep your comments respectful. In the final chapter, we leave behind the courtroom, the laboratories, and the headlines, to remember the little girl whose story changed Canadian justice forever. Part 6. The Silence Returns. On October 3, 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessop walked away from home expecting to return. She never had the chance. For her family, that ordinary autumn afternoon became the day that divided life into two parts. Before Christine disappeared, and after. For 36 years, Canada searched for answers. Police agencies changed. Investigators retired. New detectives inherited old files. Forensic laboratories adopted technologies that investigators in 1984 could scarcely imagine. Yet through every change, one thing remained constant. Christine deserved the truth. Her family deserved the truth. And the investigation deserved to continue until that truth was found. When investigators announced in 2020 that DNA had identified Calvin Hoover as Christine's killer, many people described the case as finally solved. Legally, the investigation had reached its conclusion, but emotionally, some stories are never truly over. No scientific breakthrough can restore a childhood. No courtroom can return a daughter. No announcement can erase decades of unanswered questions. Justice and healing are not the same. Christine's case reminds us of something equally important. Justice depends upon accuracy. When Guy Paul Morin was wrongly convicted, an innocent man lost years of his life. At the same time, the real killer remained unidentified. The wrongful conviction delayed, not advanced, the pursuit of justice. That is why investigators today place such importance on objective evidence. Evidence must lead investigators. Investigators must never force evidence to fit a theory. Christine's case became one of the defining examples of that principle in Canadian criminal justice. The reforms that followed influenced police training, forensic science, prosecutorial disclosure, and the handling of major criminal investigations across Canada. Those changes continue protecting future investigations today. Perhaps the greatest hero in this story was neither a detective nor a lawyer. It was the evidence itself, because someone in 1984 carefully preserved biological evidence. Someone followed proper procedures. Someone understood that future science might answer questions today's science could not. That decision ultimately allowed investigators to identify Christine's killer 36 years later. It serves as a powerful reminder for every investigator working a cold case today. Never assume today's limitations will exist forever. Science evolves, technology improves, evidence patiently waits. Christine's story also reminds us why responsible true crime matters. Behind every case file is a real person. Behind every headline is a grieving family. The purpose of telling these stories should never be entertainment alone. It should be remembrance, education, and respect. Here at the Silence Evidence, that remains our commitment. Every documentary is built around verified facts. Every conclusion is supported by evidence. Every victim is remembered as a person first, not simply as part of a criminal investigation. Because the most important name in this story is not the killer's. It is Christine Jessop, a little girl, a daughter, a sister, a child whose life ended far too soon. More than 40 years after she disappeared, her story continues teaching investigators, lawyers, forensic scientists, and communities around the world, not only about DNA, not only about wrongful convictions, but about perseverance, about truth, and about never giving up on justice. If this documentary helped you better understand Christine's story, consider sharing it with someone who values respectful, evidence-based true crime. Doing so helps preserve the memory of victims while encouraging careful discussion grounded in facts rather than speculation. Thank you for watching The Silence Evidence. If you appreciate deeply researched documentaries built on verified information, consider subscribing and joining us for future investigations. Because every cold case represents someone who mattered. Every victim deserves to be remembered, and every family deserves the truth. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always follow the evidence.